Hello everyone and welcome to the first of our live streams this week, teacher panel discussions on BTEC Nationals and BTEC Tech Award and T-Level Health. This evening we're talking about BTEC National Health and Social Care, Unit 1, Human Lifespan Development. I'm Liz, I'm the subject leader for Health and Social Care here at Tutor2 and I'm joined by Lynne. Hi Lynne.
Hi.
So Lynne has been a health and social care teacher for many years and also a head of department, and she is a subject specialist. So Lynne, Unit 1, Human Lifespan Development, I suppose let's start at the beginning. What would you recommend in terms of like scheduling the learning? So we've got a big specification, how are we going to tackle that?
Okay, brilliant. So Unit 1, I think, is more an accessible unit, compared to some of the other ones. I think students enjoy it. It is quite accessible for them. I think there's a bit of a temptation sometimes to teach the specification just as the way it's laid out, because, if you're new to tackling the subject and teaching it, then that's the way that you might go about it. However, there's 3 key learning aims. And you're looking at PIE's development, you're then looking at factors that affect development and life events, and then you're looking at theories and models that affect different parts of development and how they explain that. So there's a temptation to teach it like that, but in my view, and having taught Unit 1, I think it kind of makes sense to teach it life stage by life stage.
Right,
so
okay.
For example, you could teach infancy, and then you would go through each of the PIEs, so the physical, intellectual, emotional and social development of an infant, look at factors that influence infants, life events that might affect them, and then draw out theories that help explain the different stages that infants are going through in terms of their development. You could do that the same then for each of the life stages. And that would work quite well when you're doing later adulthood in particular, because you could do the same, look at how individuals in later adulthood develop throughout all the PIEs, factors that affect them, but you can also draw in the theories of aging, which is learning aim C, and kind of cover that off when you're looking at that life stage. So, and I think the reason why I say it's really useful to teach in that way is because the exam questions are very much about making linkages between the life stages, areas of development, factors and models. So you kind of need to look at each life stage really holistically, because the questions really lend themselves to the students being able to do that. So I think if you can do that from the onset, I think that really helps in terms of that sequencing.
Right. I'm just thinking infancy, so first life stage, quite heavy on the theories and models. So is that a bit of a challenge, do you think, to get students kind of almost from the beginning to be looking at the theories and models, or is that inescapable? I suppose, if we're starting teaching now and we're in the exam in January, we don't really have time to hang around, do we?
No, and I think in terms of students getting really good at marks in this exam, 50 out of the 90 marks in this exam are 10-marker questions. And those 10-marker questions want students to be including theories and models. I think a lot of the other parts of the content are quite accessible. So if a student's done level 2 health and social care, for example, if they've done a tech award or something like that, they would be very familiar with PIE's development and factors that affect health. So I think, no, absolutely, I would just dive straight in with the theories and get them to try and make those linkages to understand the theories in the context of the life stages. I think that's really important, rather than just looking at theories separate to that.
So linked to that, I'm just thinking as well, we're talking about in context, and we know that on the exam paper they have kind of short contextual statements for most of the questions. Would you do your teaching through context? So would you be using case studies, from the beginning as well?
Yeah, absolutely, because particularly of those longer questions, but also your 6 markers, you're having to answer a question in context. You're having to apply it to the person that's in the question, to the short contextual statement if there is one there. So I think it's kind of getting students familiar with that, but it's also a lot more interesting. So, a lot more interesting to be talking about things in terms of scenarios that actually are going to happen. And I think that prepares students better for the future working in health and social care as well.
Yeah, I guess, Unit 1 is quite relatable as well for students, isn't it? They've well, they probably won't remember their infancy, but they may have infants in their family. They certainly remember their childhood. They're in their adolescence. So yeah, I think you can use scenarios quite effectively in that way, can't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when you're teaching, when you're starting out your schedule of teaching and working how you're going to piece it together, I think exposed the students straight off the bat to exam questions, the type of questions that they're going to have. So be teaching the content, but then be looking at that in terms of exam questions straight from the beginning. I
Right,
think
yep.
that's really important because it's a, it's an external assessment. So, that's where they're going to have to apply their learning. So
Yeah.
the earlier that they're familiar with where they're going to apply their learning, the better, I think.
So you would be using your exam questions both in your lessons and maybe for homework, or
Yeah,
kind of
definitely.
consolidation.
Or if you had two teachers teaching a unit, for example, one person could teach, focus on the content, and then I've done in my school where I've sort of co-teach something, and then somebody does an exam skills application of that. So
Right.
that's quite a good way of breaking up the teaching if you've got two people
Yeah,
doing
that's a
that.
nice idea, because I know sometimes you do have two teachers and the tendency is to split the specification, the content, isn't it, between, you will do learning aim A, I'll do B, you do C.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
quite like that idea actually of one teacher doing the content, the learning, and the other person doing the application. That's a good idea. I like that. So theories and models then, we know these are really important. We know we've got 50 marks to win or lose there, and students do struggle. So what are your top tips for approaching the teaching of the theories and models? I know you said earlier, apply them to the life stages. I like that idea. Anything else that we can do?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely the trickier part of the unit. These are explanations that help us understand how we develop. We
Yeah.
might not agree with the explanations. I think that's fundamental when you're teaching the theories and models. These are just theories.
Yeah.
They're not, some of them have more evidence behind them than others.
Yep.
So absolutely teach the theories in context of, development and which life stages, and linking them to particular factors, for example. But I think at a very minimum, make sure that students have a really good understanding of the nature-nurture debate.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of the essence of a lot of the theories and models. Do they sit on more of the nature side? Do they sit on more of the nurture side? Or do they offer us actually a bit of both?
Yeah.
And so really early on, getting students really comfortable with that debate, and being able to then criticise or evaluate, or look at the strengths and weaknesses of each of the models in relation to each other. So, for example, you might be teaching Gesell's maturation theory and looking at that in terms of a nature argument.
Yeah.
And then on the flip side, you might take Bandura and be looking at that in terms of social learning. And a nurture part of the debate. So getting students to see the difference in terms of things that are kind of genetically influenced or innate versus things that are influenced by the environment. But then getting them to see that maybe something like the stress diathesis model is a combination of both. So they can start to see the difference in models and where they sit in that argument. So that's a kind of at the very basis. And I would be posing students really early on lots of questions to get them used to that kind of debating. So, to what extent do genetics influence our behaviour, or, how much influence do you think our parents have on how we develop, or things like that. So getting them to really think about those kind of debates and having those types of questions, because when they do a 10-mark answer, they have to give a balanced argument.
Yeah.
And those 10 markers will ask them to assess or evaluate, or they love a to what extent question, don't they? So that means basically you have to give two sides of an argument. You have to give a balanced argument. So getting students to understand the nature-nurture side is generally, that's what they're looking for.
Yeah.
They're looking for those two sides.
So, yeah, I guess it's quite tricky, isn't it? So we need our students to have a strong understanding of the theories and models as they stand on their own, but then also how they interact with one another, or how they expose the strengths and weaknesses or limitations of each other. So it is tricky, but I think your approach is right. They have to see how they all work together, or how they compare and contrast with each other from the beginning, so that they're making those connections kind of from the off, really. The other thing I wanted to, sorry, I was going to say, the other thing I wanted to ask you about is how, sometimes a student isn't really sure what theory or model they're supposed to use in a question, because sometimes the questions they're not explicit about that, are they? Yeah. So what, do you have like a rule of thumb? Like, do you assume that all 10-mark questions will refer to, or should refer to, a theory or a model?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, absolutely, you're right. The questions will not explicitly say they're after a model, but if you look at the mark scheme for 10-marker questions, it's encouraging you to, make judgments, to give a balanced argument. I was wrote down here things off the mark scheme earlier. They're looking for you to make linkages.
Yeah.
So it's really important that in order to do that, you need to be using models and theories, because you can't argue your point really without them. So I think getting students really early on used to the models is really important. Look, I was just looking at some exam questions earlier to try and find a good example actually of questions that are a bit more asking you to jump through a lot of hoops, I'd say. So there was one question that asks, to what extent do environmental factors influence cognitive development in early childhood? So it's asking you to think about, thinking about environmental factors, thinking about cognitive development, and thinking about that specific life stage of early childhood. But also the question says, to what extent? So in order for you to determine what extent, you're going to have to weigh up to what extent using kind of models. So a student in that type of question might be tempted to talk about, environmental factors like pollution or housing can influence your ability to study and learn. But actually, the question's asking so much more about that. It's asking you to think about the environment in terms of social learning and bringing in theories like Bandura, but also thinking about the environment in terms of attachment and things like that. It's also, because it's saying to what extent, it wants you to say, well, actually, it's not just the environment, it's genetic factors or things that are innate to us that might be influencing. So in that example, you would be thinking, okay, well, I need to bring in Piaget, Chomsky, Gessel's maturation theory. There's loads of different things that you could draw in. And when you look at the mark schemes for Unit 2, you can see how in the mark schemes, Unit 1, in the mark schemes, it's asking you to, it's giving those types of examples of the models as indicative content. So I think we know that generally in those 10 markers, they are looking for theories and models for students to get the higher band.
So you and I know from being examiners that it's perfectly acceptable for a student to make some notes on their exam paper or to write a small plan. Do you think there's any merit in maybe anytime a student gets a 10-mark question, should they maybe make a couple of notes, nature, nurture, see if they can think of some models that link to the question and the context that fall on either side of that debate to help them to have a balanced argument?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think, if students can do a little mini plan at the top, just help them structure their answer, I think that can be really useful. I mean, I always say that to my students that are particularly nervous. I find it really hard. Just sort of say, just put down on paper what you can think, what you can draw out, just bullet point, rather than having to go straight in and writing a full, concise answer. Just bullet point what you think the main things you want to use are, and then that will help you structure where you are.
And also as an examiner, if I see a plan or any notes, I read those as well. And if they're not crossed out, they can attract marks as well, can't they?
Yeah. And when you say attract marks, I think an interesting thing to note is we did some sort of analysis of average scores, and in a 10 marker, the average score of a 10 marker is between about 2.5 and about 3.8 marks. So, this is the 10 markers is a real area where students can make some real big gains. I mean, that might make some teachers feel better if their students are also getting those marks, because that's kind of like the average of what seems to be coming out from when we've looked at some of the data. But I think so really thinking about focusing on 10 markers, how you can structure that using balanced argument and really, then you can come to a good judgment at the end.
Yeah. So linked to that point about making a judgment, I think one thing that students tend to tie themselves in knots a bit is about what is the right answer. And I always say to students, do you know what? There's not necessarily a right answer, a definitive answer in health and social care. It's all about shades of grey. And I think the important thing in terms of what the lead examiner is looking for is, does the student evidence any arguments that they make? You know, are they backing up their points? Are they giving a rationale? And I always say to my students, at the end of the day, whatever you argue is the extent, or however you evaluate it, so long as you have provided supporting evidence and looked at both sides, it doesn't really matter what you conclude at the end. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, totally. And I think it's about just, it's making sure that you're including relevant and appropriate content to the question. And then how you come to a conclusion with that is kind of, up to the student, really. And it depends on the nature of the question. But, as long as they're putting in the right content that, fits the demands of the question, they can structure it how they want to, and they can, come to a conclusion that they think the stress diathesis model is the best model ever, or they can conclude that something else is. But I think as long as they've shown a balanced argument, they've shown knowledge, they've used specialist language, that's another key thing, lovely, juicy health and social care terminology, putting that in is also really important. Yeah.
So we have covered some exam skills. I wanted to ask you about, so a 10-mark answer, they're given about a page, aren't they, to write their response. How can students best structure their responses? Is there anything that you think is, a really good approach?
Yeah, I mean, I think structure is key there. There should be a structure, and students should practice these type of questions, before they sit down in the exam. They should be exposed to these questions lots. They should, teachers should model how to answer them. You can show modelled answers so students get an idea of the amount that's expected to write. There's a whole page there for students to fill, and the expectation is that will be filled. I mean, I think there's a number of techniques, and schools will probably, have their own. You can obviously do peel paragraphs or sort of meal paragraphs. So you're making a point, you explain it, you're either applying it to the question, or applying it to the context of the person that you're discussing, and then linking it back to the question. Or you can be putting an evaluation in there. We've done this thing before, haven't we, at Tutor to You, where we've talked about burger paragraphs. Double burger paragraphs. So if you think about a Big Mac in McDonald's, it's got two lovely big burgers, hasn't it? So thinking about when a student's making a point about one theory being useful to explain why environmental factors are influencing cognitive development, they then have to flip the burger for the second burger and then make a counterpoint. So thinking about, giving students nice structured ways to be able to frame their answers using, peel paragraphs or whatever techniques teachers like to use is really important. And students practicing, absolutely, being modelled a good paragraph, but then also them practicing it so that when they're in the exam, they are actually doing a nice counter, argument, particularly in the 10 markers.
Yeah, I think the key to those kind of like paragraph structures is to teach them from the get-go and encourage the student to always be using them, and maybe even at the beginning to kind of make it a habit, get them to either write out the acronym or to colour code their parts of their paragraph. So, when they're making their point, highlight it in pink. When they're explaining or evidencing their point, highlight it in a different colour, and so on, just so that it gets like really ingrained in them. So that they just do it naturally. I also used to do the same thing, where if I set them any task at all, whether it was go and read something or go and do some research, I would always say, right, when you present that back to me as your homework or your essay, use peel paragraphs or meal paragraphs, just to make it so that it becomes second nature. I think those things are important. Yeah. So in terms of, you said about juicy health and social care, key terms and language, how can we help students with that? One of the things that I've noticed with the Unit 1 paper last couple of years is that they have introduced questions where they're essentially asked to define a key term. Then that's not the command word that's used. It's usually outline the meaning of or outline the difference between two key terms. Are there any techniques that we can use to help students get really secure with this language? Because health and social care has got a huge vocabulary, hasn't it? Of lots of really strange words.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, terminology is so important in terms of students learning that, doing knowledge. I mean, one thing I quite like to do, particularly for, more lower ability learners, is to always have like a key term bank on the board. Mm-hmm. So when you're teaching the content, as new terms come up, I don't know, empowerment or dignity or whatever, just putting it in the corner of the room so people kind of know, oh, okay, this is the language that we kind of need to be using today. I really like that. I think because students then can see that on the board throughout the lesson. I mean, obviously you can do lots of testing around key term knowledge and definition, playing games, Quizlet. Blookit is a good one for that, like a fun online games where people are pre-programmed questions. It's sort of like a developed idea from Kahoot, really. So I think that's really important to just have opportunities where students are learning the key term terminology, and maybe having key term tests and things like that. I was just thinking when you were asking that question, they sort of can be describe questions as well, I think. So the 4 markers, can't they? I've seen a few. So sort of what's the difference between, describe the difference or explain the difference between primary and secondary characteristics or gross and fine motor skills, that kind of thing. And when it comes to those exam questions, if they're marked, they're often marked in pairs. Mm-hmm. So if it's a 4-mark question, they're looking for students to make a point and then either develop it with further description or explain it. Yeah. So, for example, with gross motor skills, they need to sort of define what it is. So make a point. So it's the large muscles in your body, but then further description, talking about, that's done through, developed through running and jumping and things like that. So it's getting students really familiar with the mark schemes and how things are marked. So then when they're writing their answers, they go, okay, so have I got that first mark in there? And have I got a second mark? Can I see where the examiner would give me the marks? Yeah. And I think that's quite important, getting students familiar with that earlier on.
Yeah, because they often kind of fail to take their point to the end, don't they? They kind of they start off maybe strong, and then they just kind of like fizz away, or they tend to rely on the stem, so the actual question, and they're just rewording the question, aren't they, without giving a full explanation. I mean, I think for me, when I'm in a classroom, I spend a lot of my time saying, asking, what do you think about that? Student gives me a reply, and I'm like, okay, so tell me more. What or how or why, or something like, okay, but what's the key term that we can use instead of that whole sentence that you've just used, or bounce it around the classroom a little bit. So say, Lynne made a great point, can you expand it?
I think the thing is, often I think students know more than they're demonstrating on the exam paper. Absolutely.
100%
if you give them a bit of a probe, there's lots more information in there. So it's kind of getting them to know, how they're going to be, prodded to get more information onto the exam paper, and getting them to think just because you've written 3 lines doesn't mean that's, 4 marks. You've got to kind of give me as much as you can. And if by using the right terminology, that's always going to get an examiner on side. When they see that type of language of, empowerment, rights, choices, things like that, it's always going to get, attention. So I think that's really important to think about that.
Yeah. I think the other thing I just thought about with language as well is, I know it doesn't get you marks, but it helps the examiner if you use those kind of like signalling phrases, like on the other hand. So if you're asked to explain the difference between two things, make your first point, expand it, and then say on the other hand or in contrast. The same when you're looking at a balanced argument for 10 marks. It is really helpful to an examiner to see in your 10-mark response that the student says, one theorist, Bowlby, says X, Y, and Z. But in contrast to that, this theorist says, you have to make the examiner's life as easy as possible. They don't want to do the work for the student, do they? They need the student to present it to them, and they just they're marking what's there. They're not trying to join the dots, which is what we do as classroom teachers, don't we? We we kind of think, oh yeah, I know what she means. I know what he's getting at there. And you kind of give them the benefit of the doubt. But there isn't that in an exam, is there? You know, it's just marked in a really kind of cold way.
You can practice verbally comparative language, you know,
Yeah.
so it's encouraging students to verbalise their answers using comparative language, so that then when they come to the exam, it's going to be more naturally coming, you know. So I think you can say to them, you know, okay, so give me a lovely comparative word and then give me another theory that you would use then. So, you know, encouraging that terminology, I think is really good. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, we're running out of time, so I would just like you to sum up for me, if you can, Lynne. Maybe just like some key things, some key takeaways for teachers that are just starting out with Unit 1, maybe putting their students in for the exam in January. What are your key things?
Yeah. So, think about obviously your sequencing and how you're going to teach it. Start with also doing exam skills from the onset. I think that's really important. Familiarise yourself with the exam papers, familiarise yourself with the mark scheme, and do the same for the students. So when you're giving them questions, give them a copy of the mark scheme, and then when they practice and give answers, you could show them model answers. So something we haven't mentioned actually is lead examiner reports. So every time there is a exam series and results come out, with the results published on the Pearson website is the lead examiner report, where they have lots of model answers of good answers that scored really, really high, and answers that didn't quite cut it. And I think you can cut, paste and snip them and use them in your PowerPoint to show students good examples of those. So I think really early on, coupling the exam skills with the specification and the teaching, I think is really important. My other big thing is obviously you've got to spend time on the theories and models. It's so important for students to get good grades. You need to get about 60 marks to get a distinction. That's 60 out of 90 marks to be getting a distinction. You only need to be getting about 30 marks to get a pass. But we want students to do really well on this unit. It is one of the more accessible units. They're going to probably find some of the other units more challenging. So we want some really great grades. So from the onset, start teaching the models, get them used to the models, talk about the models, get them compare the models, teach the models with their strengths and weaknesses. So say, here's this model, but actually it's been criticised because of this, and a good model to compare it with is this. So really early on, start criticising those models, but using them, getting familiar, get posters up around the room with the models, get students to debate using the models, doing class debates. I think that's really important. And there's a lot of marks to be had. There's 50 out of 90 marks to be had if the students feel really confident with their models. And do some really nice summaries, of the models for the students for revision. There's lots of resources out there. I know Tutor2U have resources to help with Unit 1 and give students those to really help them with their revision around the models. I think you can't spend enough time on that.
Fabulous, thank you so much. So you mentioned the Tutor2U resources. We do have lots and lots and lots for Unit 1, a mixture of digital resources, print resources, freebies, some that you have to pay for. You mentioned about putting posters around the classroom. We have the print versions of the posters that you can buy from Tutor2U, or you can download and print them yourself for free. We have Peel, Meal, Double Burger Paragraph handouts. There's loads and loads of resources. Just have a good explore on the Tutor2U website. I think that's about all we've got time for. Lynne, you're back at 6 p.m. tonight, aren't you, for Tech Award?
Yes, so we're talking all things Tech Award. Please join us then if you can.
Yep. Then we're doing Unit 2 on Wednesday, and I am doing T-Level Health on Thursday with Charlotte and Laura. So loads of teacher panels happening. Next week we have got Unit 3 and Unit 4, and that's it, I think, for this series. Yeah. Okay, fabulous. Thank you so much, Lynne, and thank you everyone at home for joining us. Bye. See you next time.
See you. Bye.